The wind over Cambodia's plains still carries the whispers of the dead. Between 1975 and 1979, a vision of perfection became a machinery of horror. Under the red banner of the Khmer Rouge, a nation was turned against itself. Cities were emptied overnight, families torn from their homes, and ancient temples left to crumble in silence. Pol Pot, a leader who saw himself as a savior, dreamed of returning his people to a mythical year zero, a time before cities, money, or memory. But in the pursuit of purity, he created hell. From the bustling streets of Phnom Penh to the endless rice paddies of the countryside, life was reduced to labor, fear, and hunger. The rhythm of the land became the rhythm of death. Teachers, doctors, and monks vanished first, accused of corruption by education. Then came the farmers, the workers, the children, all swallowed by a system that saw mercy as weakness. The world looked away as a nation was erased from within. This is the story of how dreams turned to ash, and the soil of Cambodia was sown not with rice, but with bones. In April 1975, the city of Phnom Penh trembled beneath a storm of cheers and gunfire. The war that had consumed Cambodia for years was ending. As columns of black-clad soldiers marched into the capital, weary citizens poured into the streets, waving white flags and lotus flowers, believing peace had come at last. Mothers lifted their children high to see the faces of the young men who wore red scarves and carried rifles. They called themselves Angkar, the organization. They promised to rebuild the nation, to end corruption, to return dignity to the soil. But within hours, the dream began to rot. Loudspeakers screamed orders across the boulevards. Everyone must leave the city. Hospitals were emptied, homes abandoned, markets stripped bare. The sick were carried out on stretchers, doctors still wearing their white coats. The people were told it was only for a few days, that American planes were coming, that Phnom Penh must be evacuated for safety. But the truth was far darker. The Khmer Rouge wanted to erase the city itself, to erase memory. To Pol Pot, the man who now ruled in the shadows, urban life was the root of all corruption. Cities were the infection, the countryside was the cure. As the exodus began, the roads out of Phnom Penh became rivers of suffering. Thousands walked barefoot for days, carrying only what they could hold. Children cried for water, old men collapsed under the sun, soldiers shot those who lagged behind. The journey that began with hope ended in dust and silence. Families were scattered, names were lost. Those who reached the villages soon realized there would be no return. The cities were closed, sealed like tombs. Cambodia had been reborn as democratic Kampuchea, a nation without time, without history. Pol Pot called it Year Zero. In the new Cambodia, the past was forbidden. Books were burned, photographs destroyed, temples looted, money was abolished, schools shut down, hospitals emptied. The people were divided into units called cooperatives, forced to live and work under collective control. From dawn to dusk, they toiled in the rice fields under the gaze of teenage soldiers. Those who questioned orders were accused of being enemies of Angkar. Those who cried for their children were told emotion was a sign of weakness. The sound of human life was replaced by the sound of shovels, insects, and the endless chanting of slogans. To keep you is no gain, to lose you is no loss. That phrase, cold and final, became the motto of the regime. It meant that every life was disposable, every death inconsequential. Pol Pot, born Salothsar, had once been a quiet student in Paris. There he absorbed Marxist-Leninist ideals, studying the revolutions of China and Vietnam. But in his mind, those revolutions had failed to cleanse society completely. When he returned to Cambodia, he brought with him a vision both radical and delusional. a belief that Cambodia could leap backward into a state of perfect innocence, free of class, technology, and history. The peasantry, he declared, were pure. The educated, the urban, the religious, corrupted. By 1976, the country had become an open-air prison. The Khmer Rouge wore black uniforms to symbolize equality, but their power was absolute. They changed people's names, banned marriage without permission, and demanded total obedience. Families were separated. Husbands and wives were assigned to different work brigades. Children were taken away and taught to spy on their parents. Trust vanished. Even whispers could mean death. Every few nights, trucks arrived at the villages. Soldiers would call out names from a list. Those chosen were told they were being relocated to a new work site. None ever returned. Their absence became the new rhythm of life, disappearances accepted like the setting of the sun. The prisons filled with the accused, men and women, who had once been soldiers, teachers, monks, and party members. In Phnom Penh, an old high school was transformed into the most notorious of them all, Security Prison 21, known as Tul Sleng. Behind its barbed wire, thousands were interrogated and tortured until they confessed to crimes they had never committed. Some were accused of being spies for the CIA or the KGB, though many had never heard of those words. The confessions were meaningless. The purpose was terror. Once the signatures were taken, the prisoners were sent to the outskirts of the city, to a place called Chuyung Ek. There, beneath the whispering palm trees, the ground was soft and wet. Soldiers blindfolded the condemned and forced them to kneel beside pits dug into the earth. Bullets were too valuable, so they used hoes, hammers, and bamboo sticks. Babies were killed against the trunks of trees. The cries were drowned out by revolutionary songs played from loudspeakers. In the villages, people could feel death even when it was far away. The sky itself seemed to dim. The Khmer Rouge called their system the Super Great Leap Forward, but famine spread faster than ideology. Fields once green with rice turned grey and barren. Exhaustion and disease claimed more lives than bullets. The soldiers demanded impossible harvest quotas, accusing the hungry of sabotage. People boiled leaves and roots for food. Mothers watched their children fade into shadows before their eyes. Yet in the midst of this horror, small acts of humanity survived. Farmers hid scraps of food for neighbors. Monks secretly buried sacred texts in the ground. Mothers whispered old songs to their babies, even though music was forbidden. The Khmer Rouge could command bodies, but they could not fully erase the soul of a people. By 1977, paranoia consumed the regime. Pol Pot began to see enemies everywhere, even within his own ranks. Entire divisions of the Khmer Rouge were purged, their commanders executed as traitors. The revolution was devouring itself. At Tul Sleng, prisoners now included former loyalists, men who had once fought beside Pol Pot in the jungles. The confessions became more absurd, claims of plots involving insects, dreams, and ghosts. Still, each was signed, stamped, and filed. The bureaucracy of death was meticulous. Meanwhile, Cambodia's borders burned. The Khmer Rouge launched attacks on Vietnam, massacring villages and daring Hanoi to respond. While the regime spoke of purity, its fields filled with bones. The death toll rose into the millions. Half of those who perished died not by execution, but by hunger, overwork, and disease. The dream of Year Zero had become a machine that consumed its own creators. And still, Pol Pot believed he was saving his country. From his hidden compound in the northern forests, he declared that the revolution was succeeding. Foreign visitors were shown model cooperatives, staged villages where smiling workers displayed their harvests. The truth remained buried beneath the soil. In the absence of truth, fear ruled. no one dared to speak of the missing. Children who had once known laughter became hollow-eyed watchers. The nights grew longer, the days indistinguishable. Cambodia had become a country of whispers, where every thought was a risk and every breath borrowed. It is said that the air above the killing fields never stays still. Even decades later, the wind carries a faint sound, the clinking of unseen tools, the rustle of grass over hidden graves. By late 1978, the illusion of control had begun to unravel. Famine had weakened the regime, and Vietnam, pushed beyond endurance by border massacres, prepared to strike. But inside Cambodia, the people could not yet imagine rescue. They were too accustomed to the silence, too broken by the years of fear. To them, the world outside no longer existed. The promise of a pure and perfect society had turned into one of the darkest chapters in human history. Pol Pot's Year Zero had succeeded only in turning back time to the age of suffering, where innocence was punished and memory itself became a crime. Those who survived would later say that the greatest cruelty of the Khmer Rouge was not just the killings but the erasure, the way they made neighbors forget each other's faces, the way they made life itself seem forbidden. The rice fields that once shimmered with sunlight now hid the bones of an entire generation. And beneath those fields, the dream of Year Zero lay buried forever. When the rains came in late 1978, the rice fields turned to mirrors of the sky. Beneath their surface, the past stirred. Villagers whispered that the earth no longer slept, that when they walked the paddies, they could feel the bones shift underfoot. The revolution had eaten nearly 2 million souls, and still the Khmer Rouge spoke of victory. The air was thick with the scent of decay and wet grass. Children dug in the mud for roots, unaware that the mounds beside them were graves. Cambodia had become a nation of the dead, living among the dead. Those still breathing moved like shadows, obeying without thought, working without hope. The few who dared to speak of escape did so in whispers, in corners of huts, at night when even the wind seemed afraid to listen. In the countryside, the regime's slogan still echoed through loudspeakers. Angkar is watching over you. But to most, it no longer sounded like comfort. It sounded like a curse. By the end of that year, Pol Pot's delusions had reached their peak. Convinced that Vietnam planned to destroy his revolution, he unleashed border raids that massacred entire Vietnamese villages. He believed he was defending Cambodia's purity, but what he truly did was sign his own death sentence. Vietnam, weary of the slaughter and emboldened by Soviet support, decided to end the nightmare. In December 1978, as thunder rolled across the horizon, the Vietnamese army invaded. They moved swiftly and silently, veterans hardened by decades of war. In their path, Khmer Rouge divisions crumbled like sand. The soldiers who once shouted revolutionary chants now fled into the jungle, leaving behind fields of corpses and starving peasants too weak to run. When Vietnamese tanks reached Phnom Penh in January 1979, the capital was a city of ghosts. The streets that had once overflowed with life were empty, silent, but for the rumble of engines and the cawing of crows. Soldiers wandered through neighborhoods where grass grew through the cracks of abandoned buildings. They found no government, no police, no schools, only bones and files. And then they found Tuol Sleng. The building, once a high school, had become the darkest monument of the Khmer Rouge's madness. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, portraits of men, women, and children taken before they were tortured and killed. Each face stared directly into the camera, unaware that it would be their last image. Blood still stained the floors. Iron beds stood in the center of rooms, their chains broken, but their purpose unmistakable. In one corner, a soldier found a note written by a prisoner before execution. It read, "I am innocent. Please tell my wife I love her." The soldiers wept. They had seen war, but never this. In the days that followed, Phnom Penh began to fill again, not with the living returning home, but with the lost trying to remember who they were. Families wandered through the streets searching for relatives who no longer existed. Survivors emerged from labor camps, skins stretched over bone, eyes hollow but alive. They stumbled into the capital like ghosts returning to a world that had moved on without them. The new Vietnamese-backed government called itself the People's Republic of Kampuchea. It promised to rebuild, but there was little left to rebuild with. The world, divided by Cold War loyalties, refused to recognize the new regime. To the United Nations, Pol Pot's government, though overthrown, remained Cambodia's official representative. It was a political absurdity that condemned the survivors to years of isolation. In the jungles along the Thai border, the Khmer Rouge regrouped. Pol Pot, still alive, retreated into the mountains, leading a guerrilla war that would last more than a decade. He declared himself the true voice of Cambodia, even as the evidence of his crimes was uncovered across the country. Mass graves were found everywhere, beneath banana groves, behind temples, under schools. The earth itself became a witness. The term killing fields was not born in Cambodia. It came later, whispered by foreign journalists who walked through the graves after the regime's fall. What they saw defied imagination. Pits filled with skulls, many still bound by blindfolds, rusted tools beside the bones, torn clothing embedded in the soil. Some graves held hundreds, others thousands. The largest sites were in places like Choyung Ek, Prey Veng, and Battambang, each one a wound in the landscape. For the survivors, memory was both a curse and a duty. They returned to their villages, planting rice once more on the very ground where their families had been killed. Some could not bear to stay, others refused to leave. Buddhist monks who had survived the purges began rebuilding temples, performing ceremonies for the restless dead. Candles flickered across the fields at night as prayers rose like smoke into the humid air. One survivor, a woman named Chum May, spoke years later of her time in Tuol Sleng. She had been a mechanic before the war, arrested without reason. Tortured for weeks, she survived only because her captors needed her to repair typewriters. "Every night," she said, "I heard people screaming, then I heard nothing. I knew they were gone." Her testimony would later help convict the men who ran that prison. But justice came slowly. Pol Pot was never brought to trial. He lived in hiding, protected by remnants of his army and political allies who still wielded influence. It wasn't until 1997 that his own followers turned against him. When he died a year later in a jungle hut near the Thai border, he was cremated on a pile of tires and garbage. The man who tried to erase history was consumed by smoke, leaving behind only ash and silence. Yet, Cambodia's healing was far from over. The 1980s and 1990s were years of uneasy recovery. The countryside was littered with landmines, millions remained displaced. The trauma was unspoken, buried beneath politeness and fear. Only in the 2000s, with the creation of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, did the nation begin to publicly confront its ghosts. Survivors stood before the court, their voices trembling as they recounted the unthinkable. Guards, administrators, and executioners were finally held accountable. For many, it was not revenge they sought, but recognition that the world would remember. Even today, the killing fields are quiet. Visitors walk among the shallow depressions in the earth, where rainwater gathers in small pools. Fragments of bone and cloth still rise to the surface after storms. At the center of Choyung Ek stands a glass stupa, filled with thousands of skulls, stacked in tiers, pale and silent. Each one once held a name, a story, a heartbeat. The breeze passes through them like a sigh. The power of the Khmer Rouge's terror was not only in what they destroyed, but in what they tried to make people forget. They wanted to erase identity, family, compassion, everything that made Cambodia human. But in the end, it was memory that survived them. The survivors carried the stories in their voices, their songs, their children. The same soil that hid the bones would one day nurture new rice, new generations. Historians now call it one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. 2 million dead in 4 years, 1/4 of the population. But numbers cannot hold what was lost. Entire languages of love and laughter vanished. Entire families erased so completely that no one remains to remember their names. The killing was not the end of life, it was the end of belonging. And yet, Cambodia endures. The same fields once watered with blood now shimmer under the monsoon sun. Children play where soldiers once stood. The pagodas ring again with prayer. Memory, painful and sacred, has become a seed of resilience. The people have learned that remembrance itself is resistance, that to tell the story is to deny oblivion. When night falls over Choeung Ek, the stars reflect in the ponds that fill the old graves. The crickets sing and the air feels heavy with both peace and sorrow. The past does not fade, it lingers, woven into the land. The killing fields are no longer just a place of death. They are a warning written in the soil, a reminder of how quickly ideology can turn to madness, how silence can become complicity, how ordinary people can be reshaped into instruments of cruelty. For those who walk there now, each step is a dialogue with the dead. The ground beneath their feet whispers the same truth, that memory is fragile, but forgetting is fatal. And so Cambodia remembers, not in anger, but in mourning, not to reopen wounds, but to keep them from closing without justice. The wind passes over the fields, rustling the grass above the hidden graves. Somewhere, a bell tolls from a distant temple. History, once buried, breathes again. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history.